I'm reading for you 12 Christmas episodes, and this is the 10th day. The Mysterious Chest by Howard Pyle. Being a true and temperate narrative of the extraordinary adventure that befell several citizens of the town of New York on the eve of Christmas Day in the year of grace, 1793, in which the mysterious chest is claimed by an owner. Upon the 24th of December in the year 1793, the ship Good Samaritan, newly arrived from Brest in France, with a cargo consigned to Mr. Amniab Beck, merchant of the town of New York, was warped into the dock adjoining the courthouse of that worthy citizen at the foot of Broad Street. Upon the same day, and at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, there being then a fine drift of snow spitting forth from chill and laden sky, and it being unusually dusk for that time of day, there entered into a private office of the worthy merchant of stranger of a very singular and unusual appearance. For the visitor, having disembarrassed himself of his muffler and opened his overcoat, exhibited a lean, cadaverous face with sunken eyes that shone very bright and alert beneath that overhanging brow. Upon the same day, and about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, there being then a fine drift of snow spitting forth from chill and laden sky, and it being unusually dusk for that time of day, there entered into a private office of the worthy merchant a stranger, a very singular and unusual appearance. For the visitor, having disembarrassed himself of his muffler, and opened his overcoat, exhibited a lean, cadaverous face with sunken eyes that shone very bright and alert beneath their overhanging brows, a head covered thickly over with a close crop of very black hair, a pair of extremely large eyes standing out like wings upon either side of his head, and the thinnest person our merchant had ever beheld in all his life. "Sir, I see you do not know me," quoted the stranger, "but I have here a letter from your no doubt valued correspondent, M. Valdon et C. of Paris, France, that will soon make us better acquainted. I am the owner, as you will discover by the note, of a certain cedar chest, which is at this moment in the cabin of the Good Samaritan, under the very particular care of Captain Coffin. It is addressed to me under the name of Remo, and it is further countersigned by a certain emblem, which consists of 2 adjacent circles perched by an arrow. Now I must, my good sir, have that chest immediately, for unless I can have it opened before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I shall regard it as being one of the great misfortunes of my life." Meantime the stranger was speaking. The merchant had been examining the paper that had been delivered to him. They were in all ways perfectly clear and explicit, and there was no possible reason to doubt that the chest was certainly the property of the applicant. Accordingly, he wrote an order to Captain Coffin to deliver the shipment, and having taken a receipt for the same, the business was closed. Captain Coffin of the Good Samaritan was sitting at a table in the great cabin when the skeleton-like stranger entered. He was very busy looking over his books and papers by the light of an oil lamp slung from the deck above. But he pushed his work aside and welcomed his visitor with gruff good nature, inviting him to join him in partaking of a stiff drink of rum, water, and sugar, which he himself was enjoying with generous liberty. But no sooner did he hear mention of the chest than his whole countenance changed, his good nature vanished in all instant, and he broke forth into such a torrent of excreant as nearly to take away the breath of his hearer. He called the dominant powers of heaven and hell to witness that the sooner he was quit of the chest and better it would be like. He declared that ever since it had come into the ship, it had brought with it nothing but ill luck and disaster, It had, he said, been sent aboard the vessel upon a Friday, and hardly had it been stowed in the cabin when a storm began to brew, and that followed the Good Samaritan with great violence for about a week. In the pitching of the ship, the chest had broken loose from its moorings and had dashed into a locker across the cabin, smashing it, not only the locker itself, but 3 cases of prime Hollands as well. Mr. Meigs, the third mate, in his effort to catch the chest and lash it fast again, had had his shin so badly lacerated that he had been laid up for 10 days or more. 3 other storms, a like unusual sort, had caught them upon this misfortune, and in such storm the chest had again broken loose from its moorings, always executing some disaster ere it was lashed fast again. From all of these, and from various other circumstances which particularized, the captain declared that it was his belief that the chest was certainly haunted. "Haunted, did they say?" cried out the owner of the chest. "You would certainly say it was haunted if you could but see what is in it." These words were uttered with such a singular meaning that the captain was struck of a sudden very serious. "Well," he said, "I don't ask to see what is in it, and I don't want to, but the sooner you get it out of my ship the better I shall be pleased." "And so shall I," says the stranger, "and there we are of a like mind, the one with the other." The mysterious chest begins its peregrinations. But now the question arose as to how the chest was to be taken away, for at the hour there was not a single soul about the dock except a watchman with a wooden leg. At this juncture the captain called to mind that the ship's carpenter was still aboard, completing some preparations for the opening of the hatches upon the morrow, would see to it that the chest was conveyed to its destination. Accordingly the carpenter was summoned, and after a great deal of contention a bargain was struck, in which the carpenter agreed to convey the chest to its destination upon the payment of $1 down in hand and another $1 to be given when the box was safely delivered. As the carpenter could no more read English than Greek or Sanskrit, he had to commit to memory both the name of the consignee and his address. In a little while, however, he had thoroughly mastered the fact that the name of the owner and the chest was Jedediah Stout, that the chest itself was to be delivered to a certain house on Van Cortlandt Street, the second from Broadway upon the right-hand side, and that the house might be further identified by the fact that it was painted white and had green shutters. It was 6 o'clock and dark as pitch when the carpenter of the Good Samaritan, with 4 stout fellows to help him, got the chest out of the cabin and started it upon that terrifying journey which brought such panic and terror into the 3 quiet households. The snow was falling faster than ever, and the carpenter led the procession with a light through the obscurity. The chest itself was of the size and shape, and very nearly of the weight of a loaded coffin, so that the cortege had such the appearance of a small funeral as it wound its way through the dark and deserted shed of dock and so to the street beyond. All went well until the bearers and their guide had reached the corner of Beaver Street and had come upon the light of a lamp that overhang the doorway of a dram shop. Then exactly at that place the ill luck that seemed to have pursued the chest from the beginning of its peregrinations overtook those who now carried it, for one of the bearers happened to set his foot upon a shot of ice, hidden by 2 of 3 inches of snow. He slipped and was precipitated violently forward. As his foothold slid away from beneath him, he dropped his end of the chest and as he fell, his stomach struck so violently against the corner of the box that the breath was driven entirely out of his body, so that he could neither swear nor make any outcry whatever. At first, terrified by his silence, the others of the party thought that the fellow had been fatally hurt, but he presently so far recovered himself that he was able to express, though in a feeble voice, his entire condemnation of this sheet of ice that had caused his fall of the chest, and its owner and everything concerning it. Nor would he consent to go a single step farther until he had been refreshed at the bar of the dram shop, in front of which the light accident had overtaken him, and into which his companions now supported him with a ready alacrity. Now the carpenter of the Good Samaritan had an excessive liking for the strong waters. In the present entrance he discovered the rum of the shovel and tongs. As the port-house was called to be so uncommonly excellent that he could deny neither himself nor his fellow repeated liberations of the same, made very stiff and hot. As a consequence, when the party left the rum shop and plunged once more into the snowy night, our carpenter found that he was not only not at all sure where Van Corthart's house was, but that he did not very greatly care. Nevertheless, directed by a certain vague and obscure sense of duty, he plodded forward, swinging his lantern, and followed by his laboring assistants, until after a considerable while he came to a broad highway crossed by another street, which he opined must be the corner of Third Way and Van Cortlandt Street. The bearers of the chest demurred that the one street was not Van Cortlandt Street after all, and that the other was not Broadway. But the carpenter was very positive that if these were not the streets to which he had been directed, they ought to be. He was further reassured in his conclusions by the extraordinary coincidence that there was a second house upon the right-hand side of the way, just as the owner of the chest had told him there would be. And though the house to which he called attention was a red brick building, not a white house, such as his employer had described, it did not appear to him that the color could be matter of importance, since one house was as good as another any day of the week. Moreover, the house upon which he had fixed as the proper destination of the chest and shutters, which he opined might be green if seen by daylight. All this being settled to his entire satisfaction, the carpenter ascended the stoop of the house he had chosen and beat a thunderous tattoo with the knocker upon the door. How the Reverend Ebenezer Doolittle received an unexpected Christmas box. The Reverend Ebenezer Doolittle was a shy, retiring man of an anemic constitution and very subject to cold and damp weather. He had married a stirring wife who shared neither his shyness, timidity, nor his feeble health, but who was of a robust build, both mentally and physically. Indeed, it was a wonder to many of their friends how the reverend gentleman ever plucked up courage to pay his address to so lovely a lady. That he must have done so, however, was evident in itself, since she was now the companion of his house. Upon the particular evening of which this history has to deal, our worthy divine was sitting in his study composing the latter section of an extremely long and, to him, very interesting sermon of thanksgiving, which he proposed to deliver upon the morrow. From a mood of profound analytical thought, he was suddenly aroused by the tremendous detonations of the knocker beaten violently upon the front door. Immediately after this, he heard his wife pass along the hallway. Then he heard her open the door, and then a man's voice, very gruff and hoarse, saying something concerning a certain chest of box. Then there came the sound of shuffling and scuffling, as of the feet of men carrying a burden, and then the thump, as of a heavy weight deposited upon the floor of the entry. By this time the reverend gentleman's curiosity had led him to quite quit his easy chair and his sermon, and he was now standing at the door, which he held ajar. From where he stood he could hear that loud altercation of voices was sounding in the hall below, and from the interlocutions he could gather that a case of box of some sort had been brought hither by mistake, that his wife insisted that it should be taken away again, and that the chief of the bearers, who appeared to be in a condition of drink, protested that it belonged to the gentleman of the house, and that he, the bearer, had been promised $1 for bringing it hither. The lady assured the speaker that he was drunk, and that she would not give him a copper, and that she desired that the chest should be taken immediately away to the place where it belonged. To this the other voice responded with great exuberance of manner, calling upon his Maker to condemn him if he would move from the spot till he had got the $1 that had been promised him. Upon this the lady's voice rose to a sudden shrill and violent, and so vehement was her denunciation of that opponents were fairly beaten down before the temper of her words. For our good divine could distinctly hear the sound of shuffling feet, followed by the banging of the door as it clapped to behind the departed intruders. Then succeeded a dead, ominous silence, broken only once by the violent concussions of a brisk bat, which the carpenter had kicked out of the snow and had hurled against the front door as a parting salute ere he betook himself back to the porthouse where he had so enjoyed himself a short while since, and where he subsequently spent with inebriate generosity all that was left of the $1 that he had received at the beginning of his night's adventure. The terrific experience of the Reverend Ebenezer Doolittle in connection with the mysterious chest. After tranquillity had fallen upon the house, so lately the scene of so much noise and uproar, the Reverend Ebenezer became aware that his wife was calling upon him to come down and see what it was that had been left in the hallway. Descending from his sanctum, he replied to this demand. The reverend gentleman discovered a long coffin-like chest standing in the very midst of the floor, illuminated by a candle, which his lady held in her hand. "Do you see," she said, "what a drunken wretches have left here?" The reverend gentleman examined the box very carefully for a while, and finally, having reached a conclusion, opined that it must have been left there by mistake. The Reverend Ebenezer then suggested that maybe the true owner of the chest could be discovered by means of the address upon the box, whereupon she replied that if he could make anything of the name on the lid, he was a great deal more intelligent than she. Upon this the reverend gentleman shook his head, for there was no other inscription than the one word Romeo. A few unintelligible words in a foreign language, a surcharge representing 2 circles pierced by an arrow conveyed no significance whatever to him. He then suggested that if they should open the box, they might learn from its contents where it belonged, and to this the lady assented with great alacrity, her assent being stimulated by an absorbing curiosity to see what was in the box. So a screwdriver was fetched, and the parson set to work to remove the lid, his labors being illuminated by the candle which his wife held for him. In a little while the last screw was withdrew, and the lid was lifted, and below was seen a mass of soft white cotton wool, The wool had been padded into a thin sheet, and as the reverend gentleman lifted it, a considerable portion of it was raised immediately, disclosed that which lay beneath. The Reverend Ebenezer Doolittle stood as if turned into stone, for directly beneath the pad, which he now held suspended in his hand, he beheld the calm, white, dead face of a head severed from the trunk to which it had once belonged, and which now lay in the coffin along with it. The dead countenance, illuminated by the light of a candle, was that of a portly gentleman, apparently a merchant of the better sort. The upper part of the body, disclosed by the lifted pad of cotton wool, showed that it was clad in decent black, and a close wig, powdered white, covered the head, from which it was slightly lifted so as to show the shaven crown beneath. This the eyes of the reverend gentleman beheld as he gazed down below the dreadful object directly beneath his fingers. For the instant upon lifting the sheet of cotton wool, he knew not what it was that he saw. Question, doubt, then dreadful and terrific certainty followed one another in such instantaneous succession that it was but a moment till a full realization burst upon him. And yet this certitude seemed a long time in arriving, and during its progressions a thousand thoughts flew like a swarm of flies through the hollow and ringing space of his brain. He had no power to move, but stood spellbound, like to an automaton, gazing upon that which his eyes beheld. It appeared to him that he no longer drew breath, and that his heart had ceased its beating. All this, as was said, occupied but a moment, and yet it appeared to him to be a portentous long time that he stood there looking upon the lifeless face that lay so close beneath the knuckles of his hand. Then he was suddenly, startlingly fetched to himself by a suppressed and smothered shriek from his wife, the clattering of the candlestick upon the floor, an utter and perfect darkness as of oblivion, as the flame was extinguished in the fall of the taper. In this darkness the Reverend Ebenezer stood with shuddering and palsied limbs, his brain expanding like a bubble, and his eardrums singing, as with a high and vibrating point of sound. He heard, as though remotely, the babbling of his wife's voice, beseeching him not to make any noise, not to say a word, not to let anybody know what had happened. "Be still, Ebenezer, be still, and don't say a word," she was saying. "We must cover it up. Cover it up. Don't let the servants hear anything." Had the worthy gentleman been called upon to speak, he could not more have done so at that moment than he could have lifted himself up into the air. "Stay where you are," babbled the lady. "Stay where you are, and I'll fetch a candle. We must put the lid back on, Ebenezer. We must put that lid back on the box again." "For the love of heaven," cried the good man in a hoarse and croaking voice, "don't leave me here alone." "I must," she said. "I must get a light. I will be but a moment, and I will be back again directly." And therewith she was gone, leaving him to face his terrors alone in the dark. When she returned with the lighted candle, they replaced the lid of the chest and screwed it down. The good parson, using more muscular force than he had ever done in all his life to make his work fast and secure. The sweat hung upon his brow in great beads, and all the while he worked, his wife stood sunk in profound and silent thought. Suddenly she roused herself and smote her hand upon her hip. "My dear," she cried, "I smote it all. The thing must belong to Dr. Stagg next door. The wretches who fetched it hither must be body-snatchers, and have mistook our house for his, and so it has been left here instead of there." "But, my dear," said the parson, "suppose it shouldn't be his any more than ours." "Well," said the lady, "we'll let that fly stick in the butter. In any case, it is as likely to belong to him as it is to anybody else, and he knows more about disposing of such things than we do. It would make, she said, a most excellent anatomy. It was not 20 steps to the doctor's door, and by some means or other the parson and his wife made shift to drag and push the chest so far through the snow, which was now several inches deep, to tilt it up upon the door stoop, and to knock upon the knocker, and then to go away and leave their burden there. The extraordinary experience of a physician and his friends in connection with the mysterious chest. Dr. Orpheus Stagg was a young physician, not yet so settled in his life but that he was greatly addicted to a little supper party with some gentlemen friends of his, where exhilarating libations could be freely drunk, tobacco smoked, and amusing anecdotes recited, without any of the disagreeable lamentations of hilarity upon which the presence of ladies is so apt to act as a check. Upon the Christmas Eve, of which this narrative treats, our medico had been indulging in such an evening of social pleasure as that just described, and now, about the hour of midnight, was betaken an uncertain way homeward with a party of 3 other gentlemen, all of whom were fully as elated as himself. Being chilled by the bitter wind, this merry party of cheerful wags were of a mind to take at last the parting cup ere they separated for the night, and with that intent they, one and all, entered the doctor's house together, a candle burning dimly upon a console table at the end of the hall. But its feeble light was quite insufficient to enable our doctor, in his present condition, to see that a large and cumbrous object stood almost directly in the path of his footsteps. Accordingly, upon leading the way into his house, his feet suddenly encountered a large and so unwieldy an object that he was precipitated upon the floor with great violence, and with a prodigious noise and a clatter of descent. "Angels of grace!" cries he. Now we changed a little bit what he said, as the author declines to repeat it. "Angels of grace! What have we here?" The light candle was brought from the console table, and by its light the 4 gentlemen discovered a large chest of cedar wood, resembling a rude coffin. Upon the box was marked the name Remo, and as a farther mark there was surcharge upon its representation of 2 adjacent circles pierced by an arrow. "What is this?" says our physician, "and what is it doing here?" "Doubtless," one of his companions said, "it is a Christmas box sent to you by one of your grateful patients, whom you have dosed without fatal result. Perhaps it is full of Hollands. Ha 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 ha! Let us open it and see." This suggestion appeared to the party to be so reasonable that a couple of case knives, sufficiently stout to serve as screwdrivers, were presently fetched, and the 4 set to work to busily that in a very little while they had unscrewed and removed the lid. "'Tis spread with wool," said one of the merry wags. "Let us see what lies beneath." And whereupon our medico, holding the candle pretty steadily in one hand, lifted the mat of cotton wool with the other, and discovered to the eyes of all the white, motionless, lifeless body beneath. Those lineaments set in the awful calmness of an immutable repose. Our doctor was not unused to the objects quite as horrific as that which his eyes now encountered, but so sudden and so violent was the shock upon his nerves at the unexpected unveiling of a dead face beneath the cotton wool that he was struck in the instant into condition well nigh as sober as ever he had been in all his life. If he were so affected, how much more dreadful must be the spectacle, have been to those who were altogether unused to such a sight. A silence utter and vast filled the entire space of the hall for fully 4 or 5 seconds of time, a silence broken at last by the piping and tremulous outcry of one of the revellers. At the sudden sound of the living voice, the doctor let fall the cotton wool again, and the face was once more covered. So dreadful was the shock that our revellers had received, that it was small wonder that another of the party should presently have declared that he found himself to be taken violently unwell, and that unless he should presently have either a breath of fresh air or a glass of brandy to support him, he should certainly swoon away altogether. The suggestion of brandy met with such a hearty acceptance by all that they instantly adjourned in a body to the neighboring dining-room, where they partook so freely of that exhilarating beverage that in a very short time they were not only raised to a fair level of mental equanimity, but were even elated above it. They now found that they could discuss the adventure that had just befallen them with some degree of cheerfulness. Our doctor declared that he had no notion of how the chest had come into the house, and he repudiated, not without heat, the suggestion of one of the party that some friend had sent it to him by way of a Christmas gift. He proclaimed with fervor that he had not a single acquaintance who would act in such bad taste as to send him such a gift, and that, so far from its being to him a cheerful reminder of the season, it was not only altogether unwelcome to him, but that he would greatly dispose of it elsewhere if he knew how to do so. At this point, one of his friends suggested that inasmuch as the chest had come to him without his knowledge, it might easily be taken away and left in the same manner at somebody else's door. This idea so pleased the party and fell so aptly into their then present mood of spirited elation that it was immediately seized upon, and after a good deal of serious discussion as to who should be its recipient, it was at last decided that the box should be conveyed to the house of old Jacob Van Cleek, the money-lender, and should be left there for him to take care of. This plan was no sooner determined upon than it was put into immediate execution. The lid was replaced, the screws into their place again, and half an hour later the 4 friends had conveyed the chest around the corner to the residence of the old usurer. Here they tilted it up against the door, and having beat with the knocker until the night-capped head of the old gentleman appeared at an upper window, and they went their way, wishing him Merry Christmas, and hoping that he might enjoy the box which they had left him, in which Mr. Jacob Van Cleek is made acquainted with the contents of the mysterious chest. Old Jacob Van Cleek's house was a tall, lean, ugly brick dwelling, so large that it might easily have held a considerable family with perfect convenience, but which contained only himself, a young and pretty niece who was his ward, and a half-grown starving maid of all work. Being awakened in the middle of the night by the beating of the door-knocker upon the door by our fastidious medico, in his companions, having heard their message that a Christmas box had been fetched for him, he knew not what to think of it, other than that some hoax was being played upon him. In this conjecture, however, he could not rest entirely easy, for he could not but perceive that the late disturbers of his repose had left behind them in their departure something large and bulky that stood upon the door-stoop beneath. Feeling a considerable curiosity as to the nature of the object, which he could only dimly behold from the elevated station of his bedroom window, he withdrew his head, closed the window, lighted a candle, and having clad himself in his breeches and stockings, issued forth with intent to satisfy himself as to what it was that had been thus mysteriously fetched to him in the dead of night. Upon the landing without, he found his pretty niece, who had also been disturbed by the beating upon the door, and who, having heard the colloquy between her uncle and those beneath, was exceedingly curious to know what the midnight visitor had left behind them upon the door stoop. She eagerly volunteered to accompany her uncle downstairs to the front door, but to offer the old gentleman replied very acidly, calling her attention to the fact that a patchwork bed-quilt was so insufficient a costume for a modest young lady to wear even to the middle of the night, that she would better go back to her bed again. He added that if he had wanted her to help him manage his own affairs, he would have called upon her without hesitation. Having thus replied to her invitation to accompany him, he immediately descended alone the hallway beneath. Having set his candle upon the floor, he proceeded with great action and circumspection to open the door, proposing to hold it ajar until he had assured himself that no party of men lurked without to welcome his adventure with a shower of snowballs. His proposed precautions, however, were instantly frustrated by the accident of circumstances, for no sooner was the door released from its restraining bars and bolts than, impelled by some very heavy weight that had been tilted against it upon the outside, it flew violently open, and a bulky object of great weight and momentum projected itself upon the money-lender so unexpectedly that both he and it were precipitated to the floor with a great noise and uproar, his shins, in their common fall, being so barked that he could not put on his yarn stockings with any degree of comfort to himself for above a fortnight afterwards. A gust of icy wind and a cloud of snow burst in through the open portals, and in an instant the light of the candle was extinguished. So chill and biting was this blast, that in spite of the smart of his hurts and the old money-lender's first conscious performance was to arise and close the door. He then sat himself down on the object that had caused his overthrow, and fell to feeling his injured extremities with a sort of tender violence, meanwhile addressing the door, the object upon which he sat, the extinguished candle, the frigid night, and even his own shins, with a vehemence of language in which he rarely indulged himself, and when his niece called over the banister to ask him if he was hurt, he assured her that with great earnestness that it was his sincere belief that she was not only an utter fool, but a hopeless idiot as well. Having somewhat eased himself by the expressions of opinions concerning the various subject of his discourse, he commanded his niece to fetch another candle, telling her that he thought that even her limited intelligence could have informed her that it was impossible for normal human eyes to see anything in total darkness. When the young lady had descended with a fresh candle, the old gentleman turned a more particular attention on that which had caused his overthrow. It was a coffin-like chest, superscribed with the word Remo, and surcharged with an image of two contiguous circles pierced with an arrow. The entire appearance of the chest was of so unusual a sort that he could in no ways conceive what it might contain. His niece suggested that perhaps it held a fat turkey and a bushel of apples, sent as an offering by some would-be borrower of money. But from this he dissented with immediate asperity, bidding her first of all to mind her own business, then to fetch him a screwdriver, and finally to go to bed. Being at last alone with the mysterious chest, the old moneylender addressed himself to the task of opening it, with intent to master a knowledge of its contents. That the highest expectations of his curiosity were more than fulfilled, the astute reader will no doubt concede with instant acquiescence. It was fully 10 minutes before the young lady heard him re-ascending the stairs with stately and laggard steps. Holding her bedroom door ajar, she immediately addressed him through the crack, desiring to hear what was the contents of the chest. For a moment or two he seemed disinclined to answer, but as with a second thought he replied in a tremulous and quaking voice that it was occam. "Occam?" she cried, with a very natural surprise. "Why, what should they do to bring you a box of oakum at this time of night?" To this he answered that the box was not intended for him at all, but was meant for Gideon White, the ship chandler. Then, feeling perhaps that his answer was not altogether adequate, he added that this particular kind of oakum came in a long case, because it was what was called long-cut oakum, being used for stopping cracks in mainmasts when they became sun-dried, and they sometimes did, and split open with the heat. In offering this explanation, he felt that his powers of invention had been stretched almost beyond the limits of credibility, but he was pleased to note that his story appeared to be quite acceptable to his niece, who, with many expressions of disappointment that the chest should have held nothing more interesting than oakum, closed her door and betook herself to bed. How Mr. Augustus Beeker finds an unexpected client. Mr. Augustus Beeker was a young lawyer enjoying great expectations but very little practice. He lived in a large and rather imposing house built in an old style of black and red brick. In this very genteel residence, which was directly next door to the abode of old Jacob Van Cleek, our young disciple dwelt with his mother, who was an elderly lady of corpulent build and great dignity of demeanor. She had, in her unmarried years, been the possessor of a considerable fortune, but having wedded a husband of high social position, but not possessed of very good morals, she had found her means so reduced as at his death that there was hardly enough left to live upon. With such a decent appearance of respectable gentility as became her and her son's quality, our young gentleman of the law was very much in love with the pretty niece of old Jacob Van Cleek. But as the guardian of the young lady set more value upon a bank account than he did upon high birth and personal merit, the suit of the enamored swain was by no means so prosperous as he and his charmer could have desired. Our hero's inamorata was not at all averse to the addresses of her suitor, but so violent was the opposition of her uncle that there could be no possible hope for the realization of their mutual happiness for at least 3 years to come, at the end of which time, she being now 18 years of age, she would become the mistress in the eyes of the law, both of herself and of her father's fortune. About 2 o'clock of the night upon which the events narrated in the history had transpired, our young lawyer had awakened from the sound and refreshing slumber by the noise of a violent beating of the knocker upon the front door of the house. Upon opening his window and inquiring who it was that so disturbed the silence of the night, he learned with astonishment that the untimely intruder was none other than old Jacob Van Cleek, the uncle of his love. To hurry into his clothes, to descend to open the door to his astonishing visitor occupied the space of about a minute and a half. By the light of the candle which he held, our hero perceived that the countenance of his caller was disturbed by some unusual and very violent emotion, as of terror and amazement commingled. The old moneylender made immediate demand that he should be instantly taken to some place where he could revive his overburdened mind, and upon being introduced into the young attorney's private office, he began without any delay to speak as follows. Sir, a terrible and astonishing misfortune had befell me. I am come to you to obtain your assistance. This I do, not only because I believe I can buy your advice cheaper than I could that of one who is older and more experienced, but also because you are not, no doubt, in need of a case that you will probably be willing to take up with one that an older man wouldn't touch. Besides this, I believe you are in love with my niece, and I have to propose to you that if you will bring me safe out of this affair, I will not only withdraw my opposition to your suit, but will even further it in as far as I am able. With this preface so astounding that our young lawyer knew not whether his sense of hearing had not played him false, the old moneylender plunged at once into the depths of the business that brought him hither. And to all that he should said our young lawyer listened with ever-growing amazement and equally increasing incredulity. He knew not what to think of that which he heard. He knew not whether to believe that his client had been hoaxed, or whether he himself was being made the subject of an old gentleman's wit. He knew not whether the moneylender had gone mad, or whether he was the victim of some unusual variety of intoxication. Yet none of these surmises could satisfy him, for in spite of all his doubts and misgivings, he could not but perceive from the distracted manner of the other that something most amazing and had certainly occurred to terrify him out of his usual dry manner. Sir, he said, 'tis the most amazing story I have ever heard tell of. You will wait till I dress myself, and I will go with you to your house to look more particularly into the business. When our hero entered the older user's house, and he beheld at once the mysterious chest standing exactly where the old man had told him it had been left, a candlestick with its guttering candles stood near by upon the floor, and taking it in his hand, our young lawyer began to examine the cedar chest with great particularity. Remo, quoted he, I can think of no such name. Nor can I, quoted the elder man. 2 circles and a broad arrow. Said our hero, I cannot guess what that may signify. Nor can I, said the other. Stay, said the hero, bending more closely over another and a smaller inscription that he observed to be upon the lid. Do you read French, sir? Not I, quoted the other. 'Tis a language I never bothered with. Nevertheless, 'tis sometimes an advantage to know the language, quoth our young lawyer. That advantage I myself possess. Therefore, let us see what is written here. Whereupon, holding the flame of the candle close to the written inscription, he bent over and perused it with great particularity. In a moment or two, having made himself master of the purport of the written word, he lifted his head and presented to the old user a countenance twisted and distorted, as by some violent though suppressed emotion. Nor was he, for a considerable time, able to regain any mystery over that inner convulsion that so disturbed him, nor to articulate a single word. At length, being able to speak, though in an unnatural and choky voice, he addressed the old moneylender as follows. Sir, he said, have you then no suspicions on what is really that hath so terrified you? No, quoted the other, except that it is a dead man with his head cut off. Now, said our hero very solemnly, that what you beheld was the lifeless form of a French gentleman high and even royal blood, who was lately decapitated in Paris by the bloody and ferocious rabble of that city. All this I read here upon this coffin, and yourself might also have read it had you but understood a little French. But why, cried the unfortunate moneylender, has this thing been fetched to me thus and at the dead of night? God knows I had nothing to do with the business, and no concern in making away with a poor dead body. I well believe you, quoted the young attorney, but it may be that some enemy hath sent it to you. However that may be, the thing is here, and now that it is here, it will, I fear, be not so easy a thing to convince others as you have convinced me of your innocence. Now I am prepared to assist you in ridding yourself of both this chest and its contents, but I will only undertake that commission upon such conditions as may be very unpalatable to you to fulfill. At this the old usurer's face fell to a very melancholy length, for he foresaw a whacking fee that would bleed him deep. What, said he, is then your condition? I pray you, be as easy with me as you can. Sir, said the young lawyer, it is well known to you that I have long loved that lady who is your niece and ward. If you will withdraw your opposition to my suit, and will permit us both to follow our inclinations, and if you, from the day of our marriage until she comes of age, pay her the interest upon her fortune, I shall be able, I doubt not, to help you out of all your embarrassment in this unfortunate business. These conditions were so unexpectedly easy to the old moneylender that his face was instantly illuminated, almost as with an appearance of good humor. Friend, cried he with great alacrity, if that be all you ask, I will grant it, and give you my thanks into the bargain, for I shall regard you in the light of the best friend that ever I had in all my life, if you will but rid me of this horrific object, which curdles my blood, I believe, to be a jelly. For indeed, if this dreadful thing is not taken away, I shall go mad, knowing that I have it about, and not knowing how I shall ease my house of so detestable a burden. Then, cried our hero, we are both satisfied that the next step in the business is to remove this coffin and its contents to my house, for once there, I believe I shall have little or no difficulty in disposing of it. If that is all, cried the gentleman with extraordinary eagerness, I myself will be very glad to help you to carry it thither. Accordingly, half an hour later, the young lawyer and his new-found client lugged the mysterious chest through the snow to the former house, and there deposited it on the back kitchen. How the mysterious chest found its proper owner. Upon the day following the night of terror, there appeared in the window of a disused store upon Van Cortlandt Street, near the Broadway, a placard announcing the fact that Herr Zimmelberger, the famous living skeleton from Germany, would exhibit upon Christmas Day, and 2 days thereafter, not only himself, but a perfect image in wax of the late unfortunate King of France. The notice said that these 2 great curiosities were then upon their way to Philadelphia, but that they had stopped for 3 days in New York, so that the people of that town might also enjoy a sight of 2 such unexpected wonders. The advertisement added that the admission was but 2 cents for adults and 5 cents for children, and it called upon the entire community to take advantage of an opportunity so rare that in all likelihood it would never be repeated. In this otherwise empty store, the living skeleton and the young lawyer stood side by side talking, whilst they considered the effigy of the late unhappy King of France. The figure lay upon a short bier covered with black veil and embellished with tinsel fleur-de-lis. It was clad very respectably in black, and the colorless waxen hand were meekly laid the one upon the other, as if in infinite repose. It was the figure that had brought so much terror into the three quiet households the preceding night. The living skeleton was Mr. Jedediah Stout, who had called at Mr. Peck's office the afternoon before. "Well," said the living skeleton, "'tis a beautiful figure, and if you had not brought it to me, 'twould have been a great loss to me this day. Now what do I owe you for a fee?" "Nothing at all," quoth our young lawyer, "not a stiver, for your wax work. It has already brought me last night the best stroke of luck that ever I had in my life. 'Twas a good thing I was able to read a little French, so as to know what it was in the chest and to whom it belonged. Conclusion. It is altogether likely that the thoughtless reader who knows this serious history will think but little of anything else than the entertainment he can find in it, but the author has recounted the several events, not that he might amuse the frivolous, but that he might supply food for thought to the more sober-minded. For how often doth it happen that the most innocent and harmless appearances will disturb the repose of mankind with terror and apprehension, for which there is only too often no foundation whatsoever. Yet to those who read in lighter vein, it may be said that the young lawyer was married to the user's niece with the grateful uncle's consent in the following spring. The end. Well, that was a crazy story, but that is the 10th episode of our 12 Days of Christmas.